I'm way too hard on the Olympics. I need to ease up. I need to get on board. I'm snobby about it, is what I am, because I like team sports and local hometown teams and following the same team for years and years and following free agency in the offseason. And then the Olympics come around, and I roll my eyes at it a little bit because I'm like, oh, great, it's some athlete nobody's ever heard of. And obviously they're very talented, very good at whatever it is they do. But you don't have the history and you don't know the backstory. You don't have the investment. But the thing is, if you carefully watch the Olympics and you pay attention to all the work they do to make these little video vignettes that tell you the backstory of the athletes, all of that changes. I need to just watch those so I can appreciate it and get into it and root for people the way I should. Because once you know what the athlete has overcome, what they've been through, all of a sudden, if they win, it is that much more meaningful. And if they suffer the agony of defeat, it is that much more heartbreaking. And likewise, when we look at the Old Testament, there are certain parts of this story that in a bubble are pretty interesting. But other than just I'm rooting for the point of view character, it's not that impactful. I root for whoever has a red, white, and blue on them. I'm an American. Great. Oh, good. Did our guys win? Great. Then I feel great about that. But that's very different than knowing the backstory. Same thing again with the Bible. When you know the backstory of what the people have gone through, there are moments where you can way more celebrate along with the characters you're reading about in the text what has just been overcome given the backstory, if you put in the effort to remember what the backstory is. And I think as we're looking at the very end of the book of Esther, we were looking at Esther chapter 10 yesterday, we are going to miss the fullness of this gold medal ceremony if we don't take a minute to remind ourselves of where we've been and what we just overcame. So we flip back a little bit here to the book of 2 Kings, right at the very end of it. Now, you'll recall that really 1st and 2nd Kings, chronologically, they come right before Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles are in there too. They tell the same story more or less from a little different perspective. We've talked about that before when we did the Through the Bible season. If you want to remember what the difference between 1st, 2nd Kings and 1st, 2nd Chronicles are, you can go back and catch those in the Through the Bible One Book Per Day series. That was season 2. So we're at the end of 2nd Kings, and the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed. It's wiped out. It's been gone for a while now, since all the way back in the 700s. But the southern kingdom of Israel has been hanging on by its fingernails, negotiating, fighting, depending on God, sometimes not getting things right. At other times, they've been on a little bit of a bad stretch as we get into the early 500s. And as this new upstart people group, the Babylonians, are starting to take ground and occupy the territory that used to belong to the now mostly defunct Assyrians. And this young Babylonian character who's looking for an easy win for himself politically and militarily, named Nebuchadnezzar, he comes along and he attacks Jerusalem. And it's a long, horrible siege, and eventually it breaks, and the city breaks, and he wins. 2 Kings 25:1. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So a year and a half or so. It's a long time. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Those are the descendants of David. That represents the future of this whole kingdom, this whole people group to whom the redemptive plan of God is attached. Remember, the Jewish people are supposed to eventually lead everybody up to the temple, take all the kings of the world by the hand, and show them the true God and how to worship the true God. That is looking really bad right here in 2 Kings 25. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put his eyes out. It's the last thing he saw. Bound him with bronze shackles and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. Wow. It is hard to imagine a more crushing defeat than what they endured there. It looked like there was no hope for the future, none whatsoever. But somewhere in there were prophets who were speaking into the situation. And very famously, the weeping prophet Jeremiah spoke into this situation. And even though he acknowledged freely before it ever happened, you're going to be taken, you're going to be defeated, he then, in chapter 29 of the book of Jeremiah, sent the captives, the exiles in Babylon, which eventually would get conquered by the Persians. So eventually that becomes Persia. But for now, the captives in Babylon, he sends them a letter of encouragement. And this is a letter that gets often quoted in this day and age in more of a moral, therapeutic, individualistic deism kind of way. But there's huge theological and prophetic implications to what Jeremiah says right here. It says, this is the text, Jeremiah 29, of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiachin and the queen mother, the court officials and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the artisans had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elisah, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It said, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." I carried, interesting language. "Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord." Isn't that crazy? Wouldn't you expect that if God wanted to prop his people up after that horrible calamity, that he would have sent them some kind of message about, we are totally going to win. Do not give up. Sharpen your swords, get ready, we're going to kill the Babylonians, and we're going to set this thing straight. I mean, that's the message of deliverance they would have wanted, but it's not the one they were getting. Kind of has echoes of what was expected of the Messiah when Jesus showed up. But no, instead, it's all this language about living lives of peace and working for the prosperity, for the benefit of the city you share with your captors. Wild. The letter goes on, verse 10. "This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I'll come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Now, obviously, that is a passage, well, maybe not obviously, but a lot of you, that's going to ring a bell. That's a passage, that little verse right there is one that a lot of people have latched onto in the last 20 or 30 years of Christianity and have made a life verse, imagining that it first and foremost applies to them in the ebbs and flows of their daily life. And you know what? You can interpret the Bible however you want. God, it's the same God who I believe cares about people today who cared about people back then, so I could see it. But it looks like that exact language and verbiage and promise were happening in a very particular, very specific context here. And I'm not sure that can, with confidence, be applied to any and all situations ever. Well, whatever the case, he goes on. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord. Again, he is taking responsibility for this. It's not like Nebuchadnezzar or the Assyrians got over on God. He is still holding himself out as sovereign over everything and perfectly willing to admit this great pain and this stuff that you hate that is going on. I own that, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. You may say, the Lord has raised up prophets for us in Babylon, but this is what the Lord says about the king who sits on David's throne and all the people who remain in the city, your countrymen who did not go with you into exile. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Again, I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Well, sure enough, 70 years to the year after Nebuchadnezzar's conquest and destruction of the temple is rededicated under an entirely new empire, the Persians, under an entirely new king, Darius, under remarkable circumstances, with the rebuilding effort seemingly being waylaid and shot because of a bad transition of power from Cyrus to his kids and then to Darius. But providentially, that order from Cyrus to rebuild the temple was written down. The temple does get rebuilt under the oversight of Darius, or during his reign. It gets dedicated in 516. And that is amazing, but still so much lingers from this story, from where we were with this horrible cataclysm that happened in 586 under Nebuchadnezzar. The echoes of that are still loudly heard all the way up to 100 years later in the time of Xerxes, and then a few years after that in the time of Xerxes and Esther. And tomorrow, I want to unpack how I think the original audience, with this story from 2 Kings and this prophecy from Jeremiah still rattling around in their heads, I want to unpack how that story of Esther would have struck them in light of all of that. We'll pick up right where we left off next time around. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.